Greetings from Serbia and welcome to another episode of NT Podcast, where science, theology, and ancient history meet. Today we are honored to be joined by one of the leading scholars in Egyptology and biblical archaeology, Dr. James Hoffmeier. Professor Hoffmeier, welcome. How are you?
Thank you. It's good to connect with your part of the world.
Thank you very much. Just for our audience, for someone who don't know, maybe Dr. Hoffmeier is Professor Emeritus at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, former Director of Excavations at Tel El Borg, Sinai Peninsula, and probably many others. Also author of several influential books, including Israel in Egypt and many more. So, Professor Hoffmeier, I do want to say something about your background and your projects and anything else.
Sure. Well, yes, I was blessed to be born in Egypt. My parents worked there. They were missionaries, so I grew up learning about Egypt, learning to speak Arabic, visiting tombs and temples, and even as a 13-year-old, I climbed the Great Pyramid back when it was legal. And so I had this wonderful, rich background in exposure to archaeology. Actually, as a 10-year-old, I went to Qumran and I actually met Roland Deveau, the excavator of Qumran, and I saw Jericho and, of course, all over Egypt. So I had all these wonderful exposures. So when it came time to go to university, the decision was very easy to go into archaeology and then at the graduate school level to specialize in Egyptology. So my graduate work was primarily Egyptology. My second field was Hebrew and Old Testament. So I was able to combine both my areas of interest in my doctoral studies. So yes, I spent 42 years teaching at university and seminaries and retired 6 years ago. But 2 years ago, I was able to work on my final excavation, and that was in Sudan before the most recent wars began. But I worked there at the Cushite site of Nuri, which is where the biblical king Taharka had his pyramid and where he was buried. So I got to do biblical archaeology in Sudan in 2023. So that was my last time working in the field. And as we say in the trade, it was time to hang up my trowel, to put my trowel away, no more digging.
Thank you very much, Professor Hofmeier. And can you tell us something about our big Kenneth Kitchen? He recently passed away, sadly. So, can you give us
Yes,
some words about? Yeah,
yes. Well, Kenneth Kitchen was a giant in our field. He was a bachelor, never married, and he was able to really devote his whole life to his research, his writing, and he didn't really have too many hobbies, although he was very widely read in many, many fields. But so he was able to devote so much of his life to the recording of inscriptions and studying, and he had such a repository of knowledge of texts from the whole Near East that he was able to bring together to provide valuable background information into the study of the Old Testament. So, yes, I met him in person in 1977, although we had corresponded 2 years earlier when I was considering the possibility of studying my PhD with him after completing my master's degree at the University of Toronto. But it didn't work out for me to do that. But in his letter to me in 1975, he mentioned that he thought he recognized my name. And of course, at that point, I was only 24 years old. I hadn't published anything. Who would know me, let alone somebody like Kenneth Kitchen? So when I met him in 1977 at a conference at Toronto, he shared with me that he became a believer in Christ during his first year of university at the University of Liverpool, which was 1951. And part of his development as a Christian and his formation spiritually was to be involved in the small Bible study groups and prayer groups. And one of the groups encouraged all the members to be praying for missionaries in somewhere in the world. So since he was studying Egyptology, he decided, I will find some missionaries to pray for in Egypt. And my parents were with a mission that was based in London. And so he got information from the mission. And one of the things that he did was to pray for the children of the missionaries working in Egypt. And so 1951, the year he uh, became a believer, was the year I was born. And so when I met him, he said, yes, I've been praying for you ever since. And so he, as long as I could remember, on the 13th day of the month, he would specifically pray for me. So obviously we had a very special connection, a very special relationship to him. He's sort of like Elijah, and I'm like Elisha, just trying to hang on to the mantle and try to do something that would reflect the kind of thing that he was known for.
Oh, what a man of faith! That's incredible honor. So yeah, we can have a whole interview about him, but we
Okay,
should move on to our topic because we today will discuss about historical Joseph and many other things, maybe composition of the book of Genesis because it's connected to the story of Joseph. So let's begin. Professor, you have a presentation, so can you give us a lecture and then we will have some questions.
sure. So yes, the debate in the scholarly world for over a century has been that we have no historical evidence of biblical characters like Joseph and Moses. And people think, well, because of all the records we have in Egypt, surely we would have some information about these people if they really were historical individuals. So uh, it's also been known for a long time that if you read the book of Genesis, in particular the Joseph uh, narratives, uh, people generally agree that whoever wrote the book of Genesis had a clear knowledge and command of Egypt, its culture, its languages, its religious institutions, its social structures, and these sort of things, because these elements are actually reflected in the Joseph story in particular. So, not surprising, the stories set in Egypt have a definite Egyptian character to them. Now, one might say, well, this is just a novel. This is Tom Clancy. Whoever wrote this did his homework, maybe even traveled to Egypt to get background information to write this wonderful story. Well, that's a very modern idea. I don't think people would travel hundreds of miles to go across Sinai in the desert to walk around Egypt and gather information as background to their story. For me and for people like Professor Kitchen, the Egyptian background reflects the authenticity of the story, even though we don't have direct evidence for Joseph. So, what I would call this is background evidence, or what we say in the absence of direct evidence, what we have is indirect evidence, background information. Now, dating Joseph is a challenge in and of itself. And here scholars will vary, with some wanting to put him way back in the 18th century, the 1700s, or early 1800s BC. Um, and this basically would cover the periods of the 13th through 17th dynasties in Egypt. This happens to be what is called the Second Intermediate Period. This is also known as the Hyksos period, in which the northern part of Egypt was ruled by foreign rulers. That's what the word Hyksos means. Foreign rulers, largely of Canaanite origin, who had come into Egypt as pastoralists. Some came as in business, some came in trade, commercial ventures at the end of the Middle Kingdom. And when the Middle Kingdom collapsed, the royal family of Egypt kind of fell apart. These people rose to power. And meanwhile, in the southern part of Egypt, other royal families were ruling. So it was a period for which there was a lot of confusion. There was even a certain amount of civil war. And the bottom line is we know very little about this period in general. In fact, the Bible places Joseph and then the Hebrew people, as we go into the book of Exodus, in the northeastern delta, what the Bible calls the land of Goshen. It's also called in Genesis 47:11, it's called the land of Ramesses. And there's little doubt that Ramesses refers to the ancient city of Pi-Ramesses, the capital city built by Ramses II in the 13th century BC. It's the only city called Ramses, and it's a huge metropolis, but that's a subject for another program. But the point is, in the excavations, and excavations in this area have been going on diligently for the last 50 years in the northeastern delta. And after the last 50 years, where both the Austrians and the Germans have been working in this area, and other excavations working in the area, not one papyrus document has been found. So the kind of archival records, the kind of records we might have that might preserve a name Joseph, or an order, or a memo that he might have sent, or a dispatch, a letter he might have written, nothing like that has survived. So what we can say is, yes, it's correct. There's no direct evidence for Joseph in the Delta, but there's no direct evidence of anyone when it comes to the papyrus record, because the Delta is moist, and this is why nothing survives. The many, many papyri we have from Egypt all come from the desert areas where it's dry. So think of this, if you're familiar with Jerusalem, Jerusalem is damp, it snows, it rains. No documents have survived, no parchment, no papyrus. What we have are the seals, the clay seals, the bullae. They survive in Jerusalem, but the papyrus doesn't. Move just not too many kilometers away, and you come to Qumran in the desert by the Dead Sea, and you find manuscripts, you find papyri, you find parchment. It's the difference in the environment. So we have no documentation of the sorts that might give us information about Joseph. So number one, then, our knowledge is very limited about the Delta, although it's growing. But we have nothing in the way of papyrology to support any administrative activities going on in the Delta. So that's number one. Even in well-documented periods, the 18th dynasty, the 12th dynasty, these would be periods like from 1900 BC down to 1850 or so BC, and the 18th dynasty would be like 1500 BC down to 1200 BC. These are our best documented periods, and yet we're still learning about and discovering new names and new individuals. So, for instance, this year, a professor excavating in Abydos in Egypt, or Abydos in central Egypt, discovered the tomb of a pharaoh that nobody ever knew before. In fact, this is the second pharaoh he has found, is from this intermediate period for which we know very little information. So he found the tomb of one of these kings from the general period we're talking about, perhaps when Joseph was in Egypt. But one of the kings' name is Senebkai, and the other king whose tomb they found, his name has not survived on his tomb. So now we have a king that has survived, his tomb has survived, but no name. So this is the reality, and especially when it comes to the hundreds and hundreds of officials, tombs are still being discovered. So, and thirdly, the Delta area of Egypt, as I've already been talking about, where Joseph lived, is poorly documented. And nowadays, because we have agricultural development, urban sprawl, many ancient sites are threatened, and many have been already destroyed. So this is a problem that we have for the archaeology of the Delta, where the main events that the Bible's concerned with in Genesis and Exodus took place. Now, As I said, one of the main points of interest for the Egyptologist side of me is to find in the book of Genesis many technical terms and personal names that are of Egyptian origin. And if we just look at some of the names that exists, such as the name Potiphar or Potiphera, these are attested Egyptian names. Potiphera, something like that which Ra, the sun god, has given. Now that's interesting because that's the name of the father-in-law of Joseph. And Joseph, you may recall, in Genesis 41:45, marries the daughter of Potiphera, who was the priest of On. On is the Egyptian word for what the Greek Septuagint called Heliopolis, the city of the sun. This was the major cult center for the sun god of Egypt. Today, Heliopolis is a northern suburb of Cairo. It's still called Heliopolis. But there was a massive temple to the god Re or Atum, and the priest there, not surprisingly, has the name of Re incorporated into the name. So Joseph actually marries the daughter of a priest of the sun god, and so that fits very nicely. The word Pharaoh, that so commonly is used in Genesis and Exodus, is actually a title. It's not a personal name for the king. Pharaoh means the great house. It's like referring to the president of the United States as the White House. And even today we see in the news, we hear in the news where somebody will say, a reporter will say, the White House says. Well, we know the White House doesn't say anything. It's a reference to an allusion to the king who lives in the White, or the president who lives in the White House, just like the Pharaoh is the king who lives in the great house, the palace. The wife of Joseph, Asenat, again has been recognized as an Egyptian name, meaning she belongs to you, which might have been a nickname that the Pharaoh says, okay, you can marry her, she belongs to you. And that was actually a known name, Asenat. And of course, Joseph was given an Egyptian name. And that Egyptian name has been disputed as to how to break up the different components. But Zaphenath Paneach, what we are certain about is the final element. Anach is the Egyptian word for life, Ankh, the key of life, or the Ankh sign. And Professor Kitchen thought the name should be understood as Joseph, who is called Ip Ankh. Ip Ankh. Ip Ankh is a known name. And so he might have been named by the Pharaoh, used the word life because through his dream interpretations, Egypt was going to survive these difficult times and life would be granted to the people of Egypt. So the name seems to incorporate the reality of Joseph's work. So Egyptian personal names and titles are reflective of real situations. Now, we're told in the story, we'll take it from the beginning, we'll walk chronologically through some of the narrative and look at some of the Egyptian elements, or at least things archaeology tells us that help us frame the story. We're told in Genesis 37 that Joseph was sold for 20 shekels of silver. To the average reader, we look at that and say, is that a lot? Is that a little? And so the question is this price reflect a time period? In other words, the ancient world had inflation like our modern world, and things tend to get more expensive as time goes on. Now, one of the wonderful things that Professor Kitchen did was that he studied the price of slaves, and that's reflected on the green line. If you looked at different sources from the Near East, so if you go back to the third dynasty of Ur before 2000, the price of slave was 12 shekels of silver. In the old Babylonian period, which is the time of Hammurabi and maybe even the time of Abraham, the price had gone up to 20 shekels. By the time we get to the period of Moses, and we also see the price at Ugarit, which is in Canaan, northern Canaan, at Nuzi in northeastern Mesopotamia, the price had risen to 30 shekels. And then on the far right of the chart, you see in the Assyrian period, each of the Israelite men had to pay 50 cents to avoid being the slaves of the Assyrian king. So the price of slaves had gone up to 50 shekels. And then when you get to the Persian period, you can see inflation shot off the chart over 100 shekels of silver. So what then Kitchen did was to draw the red line is based on the prices we see in biblical sources compared to the green sources from the ancient Near East. And you see how they align perfectly. So Joseph's story fits into this early second millennium era, and certainly before the 13th, 14th century, when the Sinai covenant would have been made, and the price of a slave there is to be redeemed as 30 shekels. So again, it's these little kinds of details that help convince me that we're dealing with some sort of reality. What you're looking at here is a papyrus in the Brooklyn Museum that contains the names of foreigners who are working in the household of an Egyptian master, a higher ranking official. And the list not only gives the names of many of the workers, and we learn from their names that they are Semitic speaking people. The names are Semitic, not Egyptian. Joseph, we're told in Genesis 39:2, was a household servant, which in Hebrew would mean al-bayit, over the house. On this list, household servants were called cheri-per, per meaning house, cheri meaning over. So the Hebrew al-bayit, over the house, and the Egyptian cheri-per for a household servant, as seen on this papyrus, and it dates to maybe the around 1800 to 1700 BC. So roughly the period of Joseph, maybe a century earlier or so. But in any event, we find that the position Joseph held was like other household servants at that time, working for an Egyptian master of status who could afford to have slaves and keep them and feed them and so on. And that's exactly what Joseph is doing, the same as we see on this papyrus. Later on, Genesis 39, he's promoted to be the overseer of the house. He becomes the overseer, he becomes the manager. And in Egyptian, this is called the Emira Cheriper, the overseer of the household servant. So once again, we see that Joseph's career as he's rising follows the known kinds of positions one would occupy in a well-to-do nobleman's house. One of the things that we have on this chart, as I mentioned, or this papyrus, are the names of Semitic-speaking peoples, some of the slaves. And one is called the Semite. The Egyptian word is A'amu. The A'amu Tatwit, who is called Anku Em Heset, which is interesting. It's a woman's name. So we have her Semitic name, Tutwit, and then she has an Egyptian name, Ankh Em Chesut, the female household servant. So like Joseph, we have Joseph who is called, and then an Egyptian name. On this papyrus, we see the same pattern. You have the Semite name, and then an Egyptian name for the same person as a household servant. Now, one of the most interesting discoveries was made in 1987, and we are just at the entrance to the Saqqara necropolis. Saqqara is the necropolis for the city of Memphis. It has a long and rich history from the earliest dynasties of Egyptian history all the way down to Roman and Christian times. But in this cliff face, which you see, on the left side, you can see sand. Over here, there's sand. But up until the mid-1980s, all of this cliff face was covered with sand that had blown in. And a French archaeologist named Alain Zivy excavated this. And among other things, right here, he found the tomb of a man named Aper El or Abed El. And this is a Semitic name. It's a Semitic name. Here's his picture inside the tomb. He looks like an Egyptian, but he has a Semitic name. Now, what we find out, and this is very interesting. Number one, he tells us that he was a child of the royal nursery, a child of the royal nursery, meaning that he was raised in the court of Pharaoh as a child, would have been educated, trained, much like we read about in the case of Moses. A young boy, foreign prince, as it were, raised in the court of Pharaoh, educated, made literate, all those things, but looking like an Egyptian. So when you see this man, he looks like an Egyptian, he wears a wig like an Egyptian, hieroglyphs are written in his tomb, and yet his name is a foreign name. It's a Semitic name. And so is the name of his wife and his son, who are mentioned in the tomb. So this high-ranking official became the vizier, the prime minister under Amenhotep III and Akhenaten in the 14th century. So we're talking about the same general time period as Moses and maybe a century or two after the time of Joseph. In other words, the idea that Joseph could be elevated to a position high in the administration is now attested. And this is a tomb that we knew nothing about. We knew nothing about this high-ranking official, the number two man in the country. I say number two because during this period, there was a vizier of northern Egypt and a vizier in southern Egypt. So there are two viziers who worked for the Pharaoh. So this discovery was huge because it shows us that a person like Moses, like Joseph, as a foreigner, could be brought into the court, educated, and then work as an administrator. Moving on into the narrative, when Joseph has his dreams, it seemed to predict the future, and God, according to the scriptures, gave him the ability to interpret the dreams of others. And of course, in prison, he meets two officials whose dreams he interprets. Now, one of the reasons why, if you read the story, the two officials are very upset is because they know that dreams are a way that the deity speaks to them. But when you have a dream and you want to know what it means, you have to go to a priest, and the priest has a document. We call it a dream interpretation papyrus. I'll show you one in a moment. But before we get to that, the Hebrew word for these magicians, as it's translated, is the word chericheb. And these are actually priests who were literate. Not all priests needed to be literate because some just did purification rituals, did other things, but these priests were able to read. So here on the left, you see one, and this long thing that he's holding in his hand it's a papyrus document that's stretched out. Okay, and similar to here on the right, this guy's holding a papyrus, which means they are reading the spells in connection with whatever ritual's going on. This could be a funerary ritual. This could be a temple ritual. Something happens when you're being buried, and you can see that pouring out libations and offerings and so on. So it's interesting because the Hebrew word that is used in Genesis 41:8 and 24 is derived linguistically from the Egyptian term for these priests. So in other words, these were literate priests who had the dream interpretation manuals, who had other documents that they could read from. So here is one of these dream interpretation. Well, this is actually what happens when Joseph interprets the dream. I'm sorry. And this is a familiar passage from Genesis 40. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, Hebrew word tov, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream. There were 3 cakes of baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh. but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered, this is the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you. Literally, he'll take your head off and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh. That was a very bad outcome. So notice that the first official, that when when Joseph interpreted his dream, it was a good outcome. Okay, the first guy's dream was good, tov, and the second guy's dream was bad. Here is Chester Beatty papyrus in the British Museum in London, and what you see here are dreams followed by, and here you can see, maybe you can see the sign going right down this column is all the same sign, and you see it here too. These signs mean nefer. It's the Egyptian word for good. So just like the Hebrew word tov, there are another series of dreams here, and the outcome is bad or evil. So certain dreams, good outcome, other dreams, bad outcome. So we have 2 officials of Pharaoh. One has a good outcome dream, one has a bad outcome dream. And here is some actual translations. So I want to give you an example. If a man sees himself in a dream at night tying up someone else in order to harm him, good. It is a sign of destroying his enemy's power of speech and conquering him. So if you dream this, it's good. The second one is, if a man sees himself in a dream turning his face to the ground, bad. It's a sign that something might be required of him by death. So this is exactly what happens to these 2 officials. Good outcome, live. Bad outcome, die. So it's very clear to me and to others that the dream interpretation papyrus is what the 2 officials did not have access to in prison, and Joseph acts as their dream interpretation. But had they had a dream interpretation that could handle this, the hope is that you get a good outcome, not a bad outcome. So again, this fits very nicely into the situation in Egypt. Now, you remember in the Joseph story, one of the issues was that the Pharaoh's dream pointed to the coming of 7 years of drought, 7 years of famine that would be preceded by 7 bountiful years in which the Nile flows nicely, there's good agriculture, etc. Now, in the story, the actual Egyptian word for Nile is used. It's Yaru, and it's Hayor in Hebrew. So this is not the generic word for river. There is a generic word, Nahar, which means river. But the author clearly knows that in Egypt, it's not just any old river, it's the Nile. And in Egypt, every year, thanks to the rains in Central Africa and Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, the 2 branches of the Nile would flow from the south, come together, the Blue Nile and White Nile at Khartoum in Sudan, and then flow north to Egypt. And when this flood occurred, it was usually in the months of August, September, October. And Egypt's survival was dependent on these annual floods. So the hope is you get lots of water, good irrigation, prosperity. If the Nile levels are low, it means that the farmers have to irrigate. They have to bail with a bucket-like instrument to bring water into their field. So it's much more work. You don't get as much water, and you have poorer crops. So from the dawn of history, this was a big issue for Egypt. So the divine wisdom that Joseph receives 7 prosperous years, followed by 7 bad years. Now, this was a big deal in Egypt, so much so that the ancient scribes actually kept records of the Nile levels. And they did this at different places, but the most important one is in southern Egypt, which I'll show you a picture of in a moment. But these records were kept. Now, there is a memory in Egyptian literature from the Hellenistic period, that would be the 2nd century BC, there is an inscription carved on a big stone near Aswan. I'll show you to in a moment. But the story is set in the time of Djoser. He's the pyramid builder of the Step Pyramid around 2700 BC. And in it, he is recorded as saying, I was in distress on the great throne, and those who are in the palace were in heart's affliction for the very great evil, since the Nile had not come in my time for a space of 7 years. For 7 years, there was no flood, there was no annual inundation. Grain was limited, fruits dried up. So this is what happens. And so here's this memory, and it's preserved on this rock, written in the 2nd century BC, but it's reflecting back on events at a much earlier time. And this is on a small island just south of Aswan, which was the ancient southern border of Egypt. If you go to the Elephantine Island today, you can see this wall on the east side, and this was part of a Nilometer that was used to measure water levels in the Nile. Now, this one is 19th and early 20th century. So even until recent times, they were keeping track, and you can see the steps, the markings on the wall, and so on. So they could say, aha, we're going to have a really good year because the water's at this level on this date. Or if it's way down here, okay, it's going to be a bad year. Now, again, this was such a concern of the Egyptians that we have documentation for this going back to 3100 BC, starting in the first dynasty and what follows. This was a large stone block that may have been a meter and a half, 2 meters. We only have parts of it. The whole does not exist. The largest part that you're looking at is actually in Palermo, Sicily. And there are fragments in the Cairo Museum, fragments in Oxford, I believe, and in the British Museum. But every one of these little boxes represent a year. And this is the symbol for a year. It's a stick with a bent over, it's a palm branch. And it tells you something important that happened that year in the life of the king. And then down here, this is the sign for a cubit. So the water level was 6 cubits. Here it was 4 cubits. Here it was 2 cubits. Here it was 8 cubits. Now, we don't know where they are making their water readings, but clearly they're keeping records, and this goes back a long time. So when you look at this and you say, aha, this is why what Joseph does for Egypt is so important, because this is what kept Pharaoh up at night, as it were, and gave him bad dreams. What if the Nile doesn't flow? The economy crashes, basically. And the longer it goes on, the worse it gets. So again, you can see why Joseph's role in the story is so important and beautifully fits the Egyptian context. Here's one scholar's attempt to reconstruct the whole thing with the various fragments. So anyway, it was a large stone, probably in a tomb from maybe around 2300 BC, and it had the records for the previous 700-800 years. All right, Joseph gets promoted. And here we are told that Pharaoh was so pleased with him. He said, since you're so wise, you will be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves at your command. Only as regards to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. Now, what we see in these few verses can all be illustrated from Egypt. Here, for instance, is an official named Hormin from 1300 BC, and this is in the Louvre in Paris. So anyone in Europe, if you go by the Louvre, you can see this beautiful carved relief, and you can see King Seti I on the left, and a chain is being put around the neck of this guy. And in this case, it's because he is being promoted to be the new vizier, the new prime minister. So you can see it comes with promotion, just as it does in the case of Joseph. Here's another example, and this is a general named Horemheb, who eventually became the king, King Horemheb, following the reign of Tutankhamun, King Tut. And here is Horemheb. This was in his tomb at Saqqara. And notice the gold chains being put around his neck. This was reward for extraordinary activity as a general. He led the military campaign against Nubians and a campaign into Syria against the Hittites. So here he's being decorated with gold put around his neck. So in Joseph's case, he's given gold because he's promoted. Now the signet ring, you see on the left, these are rings that had what we call the scarab beetle, the underside of which you have various decorations and hieroglyphs. It might have the name of the king. It might have the name of the official. It might also include his title. On the right is one that I actually found in our excavations in Sinai with the name of Queen T. She is the mother of Akhenaten. Amenhotep III was her husband. So these were the rings that you could use to seal documents, thereby exercising authority on behalf of the person named on the ring. Here are just some inscriptions to show you, all in red, that you have an administrative officer called the overseer of the Khetem. The Khetem is the seal, the king's seal. And these inscriptions were actually found in Sinai. And these were on trade missions when the Egyptians went to mine turquoise, and smelt copper. We had an official going along who had the authority of the king to conduct the campaign, the mission. And so these are inscriptions by a private individual. And here you can see the string with the seal stamp here. See the same thing here. So that's what Joseph was. If I am right, and Professor Kitchen also thought so, is that Joseph became the vizier. That is the prime minister. On the left, you see a statue of a vizier from about 1700, 1750 BC. And on the right, the vizier named Rechmire from the reign of Thutmose III, or the 15th century BC. And notice the beautiful white gown he wears. The beautiful white gown. And Joseph, we're told, was given a white linen gown to wear. And the white linen gown, in fact, the word linen in Genesis is the Egyptian word for linen, not the Hebrew word for linen. So again, the context fits perfectly. Now we get to Jacob's death. And when he dies, we're told that he lived to be 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin. Now, it's been noticed, and I think it makes perfect sense, that 110 represents the ideal life of an Egyptian wise man, a sage, one who faithfully served the king. On your right is a very important official named Amenhotep, the son of Hapu. He was the vizier under Amenhotep III, and he oversaw many of his great building projects. And he became the vizier, the prime minister of Egypt. And we're told on the statue that he received 110 years as a gift from the king. And that saying goes back even to earlier wisdom literature, where the text reads, I had 110 years of life as a gift of the king. This is in the wisdom text. And in Papyrus Westcar, for instance, there's a sage named Jeti, and he is a man of 110 years. So this name occurs, or this year span of life of 110 is there are more than 20 cases of this in Egyptian literature. And so it would seem then that Joseph is being credited an honor that only the Egyptian background would understand. As we know in the Bible, 120, maybe the lifespan of Moses, would be of special meaning, but 110 only has special meaning in Egypt. By the way, there's one other person in the Bible who lived to be 110, and he too was born in Egypt, and that's Joshua. So if you look at Joshua 24, he dies at age 110. So in Genesis 50, with the death both of Jacob and then his son Joseph, we read after Jacob died, and Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. Embalming is something you do in Egypt. You don't do it in Canaan. You don't do it in any other country of the Middle East. This is uniquely an Egyptian practice. For 40 days were required for it. That is how many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. Now, notice here, there's two things. 40 days were required for embalming, and altogether 70 days. Now, what this is referring to is 40 days of embalming and then 30 days of mourning that takes place after the burial. And so it's a 70-day period altogether. So when Joseph dies, again, Joseph died 110, they embalmed him and they put him in a coffin. So here you're looking at the kind of wooden coffins that may well have been used in the period, the general period of Jacob and Joseph. Then lastly, in the tomb of an official named Jehuti, this is in Thebes or in Luxor today, in this tomb, there is an inscription that says, of the dead, your 70 days are completed in the embalming chamber. So here's the 70 days that reflects the 40 days of mummification and the 30 days of other mourning rituals that would have gone on. So the 70 days of the mentioned in Genesis is exactly what we find in an Egyptian tomb, and this one dates to the 15th century BC. So again, not too far removed from Jacob and Joseph. So I've tried to follow the narrative from the beginning, the sale of Joseph, all the way down to his death, mummification, the burial period, the mourning period, and we see that everywhere along the way, the Egyptian data and the biblical data converge. So I think this is a good case that one can make for the authenticity of the story. It doesn't prove it, but if these details weren't there, then it would be very hard to argue for the historicity other than to say, well, I have faith in the Bible, which is wonderful. But for the skeptic who might think this is all made up stories, everything seems to fit into Egyptian literature and archaeological data. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hoffmeier. Fascinating presentation. I learned a lot. Even I viewed before many lectures about this topic, but always something new. So thank you. And now objections from critical scholars. Let me ask those. My first one is in the story of Joseph, who actually sold him in Egypt, the Midianites or Ishmaelites? The text seems to present a contradiction. So how should this be understood?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, because on the surface, again, to a simple reading of the text, that might look to be a problem. If we look more broadly and you do word searches of Ishmaelites and Midianites, first of all, we go back to Genesis 25, and there we learn that after the death of Sarah, that Abraham had another wife with whom he had, I think, 7 sons, and one of them was Midian. So Abraham is the father of Ishmael by Hagar and the father of Midian by Keturah. So the Midianites and the Ishmaelites were both tribes descended from David. And in later history, we find them almost indistinguishable. So for instance, if you go to the book of Judges, Judges 8 and verse 22, when the judge Gideon is fighting against the Midianites, they are also identified as Ishmaelites. So Ishmaelites and Midianites are both descendants of Abraham from different wives, and they were part of the same, if you will, tribal league, or the tribal groupings, like they were clans of the same tribe. So both terms are right. So the writer actually is telling us he knows all about them, that he knows the more intricate details of this tribal association. I should say very often, this is a general statement, that many people think they found problems or mistakes in the text or contradictions, and it really is, the problem is our ignorance. And once understood within the biblical context or the Near Eastern context, many of these things evaporate, which is why this kind of research is important to help people get over those um, problems they encounter when they read scripture.
Thank you. Just quickly, we have verse 37, 27, and 28. It says, like, come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him. For he is our brother and our flesh, and his brethren were content. Then there passed by Midianites, merchantmen, and they draw and lifted up Joseph out of the pit. So, question is, who is they? Is that the Midianites or brothers in a previous verse?
Yeah, it's a little bit ambiguous. I assume it's the brothers because they put him in the pit. They're pulling him out. But yeah, you're right. That does look a little ambiguous.
Yes. Okay. So that's really common. So sorry for
Yeah, it's
quoting.
all right.
So let's go next. Kenneth Kitchen says that the Padi deity form of names appears only from the 13th century BCE and later. Is it likely that someone would have been named Potiphar during the time of the Hyksos or Joseph or
Yeah, that's an interesting problem. I think we have two different issues here. Number one, when the stories take place, and two, when were they written? So the the issue of when that took place, if we put Joseph in the Hyksos period, which makes sense to me, this would be the period roughly between 1700 and 1550 BC, in that 150-year period there. That would make sense to me on a number of levels. But if something took place, but the story is not being recorded till the days of Moses, if Moses is the author, and if Moses is in the 13th century, which is what I believe, that's the working hypothesis I have, along with my friend Kenneth Kitchen and many, many others scholars, then the story is about events that took place at an earlier time, written in the time of Moses. So in that case, the names would fit. Is it a case that we didn't actually know the names? Did the names not survive and that Moses gives them names, contemporary names to fit the story? We don't know. But at least, again, we have to distinguish between when events took place and when they're written about. And I think that difference may explain some of these elements that would point to a later time, that is the 13th century or 14th century.
Yes, it makes sense. But what do you think about theory of Gary Rensburg and also Benjamin Mazar? They argue that Genesis was written in the 10th century BC in Jerusalem, and that it reflects the situation of that time. So we have materials from Moses, 13th century BC, but it is written a little later. What do you think about that?
Yeah, Gary is a good friend of mine. In fact, we've co-authored some things together. We've edited books together. Um, so I'm what in my scholarly when I put on my scholarly cap, I'll often cite Gary Rensburg and say that he uh, argues this way, and I can agree with that, but I think it probably goes back earlier. Um, so I don't think in the 10th century the story was written down for the first time. Um, uh, so again, I'm more of a traditionalist. Um, Unless there's good evidence to uh, contradict the tradition of Moses' authorship, that makes sense to me on many levels. I'm not claiming that Moses wrote every word of the Pentateuch. Uh, Deuteronomy 34 talks about things that happened after he died. Um, and um, uh, we also read in Deuteronomy that Moses was the most humble man in the world. So I don't think you could be the most humble man of the world and write that about yourself. So I think there are differences between, let's say, the narratives of Genesis, um, and the legal material and these uh, uh, different elements that could have originated at a different time. I mean, there's certainly things that the Bible tells us that Moses recorded these things. He recorded the laws, we're told. In Exodus 17, we're told that God told him to record what had happened in the battle against the Amalekites. And Numbers 33 tells us that he recorded the journey, the step-by-step itinerary of their travels. So there are specific places we're told that Moses was writing. So in my mind, clearly he has a major role in the writing of the Pentateuch.
Right, but they argue also that Joseph's story reflected the conflict between the tribes of Judah and Joseph in the later history of Israel. Is that plausible?
No, I don't think. I think that's the kind of scholarly speculation that does not advance biblical studies. I mean, because Judah and his brothers are disputing about how to handle Joseph, I don't think that's being written to make the tribes look better in later history. Again, that's again, if you look at the Joseph story, and this is where I think the work of Brevard Childs is important. He was a professor of Old Testament at Yale Divinity School, and his idea is, well, what's this doing in the canon? What's the place of this narrative in the canon? And it's very clear on literary grounds. If you look at the work of Robert Alter, he talks about the way the different narratives are linked in the Joseph story, and it obviously plays an important role. Again, the largest story, I mean, the Joseph story is as long, if not longer, than the Abraham story. And the Joseph story is longer than Isaac's story and Jacob's story. So why does his story get so much when he's not in the Davidic line? He's not from the tribe of Judah. He's not in the Messianic line. So why is his story so important? And I think the importance of his story canonically is that he saves the people of Israel. He saves them from death and famine. And so his role is more of a savior role than a biological one. So in any event, so I think that um, when you look at I try to do work at both the literary level, what's going on in the story, but also then what's the archaeological background material. And I think they work together. And sometimes people only look at one or the other, and I try to bring them together. So I think that's speculation. It's interesting. I don't think it's necessary.
Very good. Let's talk about that. Do you believe that there is two sources, J and E, that combines this story of Joseph? And if not, can you give some indications of the unity of this narrative?
Yeah. Well, I just hinted at the unity of the narrative because it's interesting that from Genesis 37 to through Genesis 50, you have some interruptions. So you have Joseph being sold as a slave, and then you have the story of the Tamar and the birth of the twins uh, by Judah in Genesis 38, which seems to interrupt the flow of the um, of the sequence, interrupts the flow of the Joseph story. It's very odd. You look at it and say, okay, why is Genesis 38 here? And it's interesting, and this I owe to Robert Alter, who noticed that in Genesis, when Joseph is taken away as a slave, his brothers take his famous coat and dip it in blood and make their father think, oh no, my son is dead. And the text says, when he saw it, um, in verse, this is 37:33, it says, my translation, ESV says, identified it, but it's also the word, he recognized it, yakar in Hebrew. So here you have the word yakar used. in Genesis 38, which seems to have no connection whatsoever to Genesis 37 or 39 and following, what you have is when Tamar is found out to be pregnant and she had somehow hidden her identity from her father-in-law, she had taken his walking stick, his rod, and his seal, which was his signature, and she says, "This is the man who impregnated me." And Judah looks at it, and this is in 38:26, and said, and Judah recognized it. Okay. So we have this element of surprise recognition one more time, and that's when Joseph recognizes his brothers. So this word yakar occurs only 3 times in Genesis, and it's in these 3 consecutive episodes. So clearly there is a tying this together, unifying even what seems to be disparate stories, disparate narratives. So I don't think the whole idea of J and E that doesn't seem to hold up very well, especially once you get to chapter 39 and following. I mean, they tried to make that work in 37 because you have Midianites and Ishmaelites, and that was seen as the mixing of traditions while ignoring who these two peoples were. So so I would say there is definitely a literary unity. And what's interesting is those who argue that the Joseph story is a novella. Novella is a short novel. That's a short story. They all agree on the literary side that it's a unified story. So literary people, those who look at it as a piece of literature, do not see the sources the way the source critics do. And so they see it as a novella, which of course then means it's fiction. It's a novel, it's a made up story. So what I like to do then is say, okay, you have it right. There's a literary unity, but then look at this background material that makes it authentic. Again, these are details of the story that people in the 10th century probably would not have recognized in Jerusalem. 110, the 70 days of mourning and mummification. These are details I don't think I think people just coming out of Egypt would have said, oh yeah, we know what that's all about.
Amazing. Correct me if I'm wrong. The story of Sinuhe, that's also novella, and that's not fiction. It's something that happened, right?
Well, yeah, this is debated whether he's a real figure or not. Kenneth Kitchen leaned towards him being a historical figure. Most Egyptologists don't. It's literary, but we'll never know. I mean, we might come across his tomb one day and this, aha, now we know. So yes, but yes, those who study novella and look at parallel stories, most of the parallel stories um, are of historical individuals. If we leave Sinuhe aside, the others they compare him to are actual historical figures, like
Yes.
Sargon. Nobody disagrees that Sargon the Great, and yet you have this novella about his birth, but he's a real person.
Yes, I read Kitchen, so I thought, okay, he says it's a history, so it's history. I didn't know that there is a dispute. Okay, so scholars would point also that there is a gap between Genesis 50 and the beginning of Exodus, so that proves something about sources. So can you explain that? Why there is a gap of a few centuries between Joseph and Moses?
Well, I don't think it's a matter of sources. I think um, that basically Genesis ends with the death of Joseph and the prospect. And remember, he gives this prophecy about, hey, we're going to leave, we're going to go back to the land God promised us. And when you go, take my bones with you. And so in the book of Hebrews, this is seen as Joseph's faith in the promises God had made him. So once Joseph dies, the book of Exodus picks up with the conditions in Egypt into which Moses was born. So, I mean, there really is, again, I think the the book of Genesis, then the book of Exodus, the other book seem to be focusing on God's activity. And so with the death of Joseph, there's this gap. There's no leader, there's no prophet, there's no revelation. And then things pick up then with the conditions in Egypt that led to the Exodus and the birth of Moses. So I don't think it's a source issue. I think it's a literary way of dealing with a time gap. Um, and the other thing to bear in mind too is when you're dealing with scrolls, papyrus scrolls, I believe the longest scrolls we have are maybe somewhere around 10 or a little over 10 meters long. Uh, and so they didn't make, 100-meter long scroll or a 20-meter scroll. It's just too big, too cumbersome. So, it would be natural to put things in to break them up. So many scholars believe that Isaiah is not two Isaiahs, but they're two scrolls, 1 to 33 and 34 to 66. Similar with Jeremiah 1 through 26, and then 27 and following, or 1 to 25 and 26 and following. And similarly, if you look at Ezekiel 1 to 33, 34, or no, 1 to 24, 25 to 48. So you could talk to Dan Block maybe about that. But if you'll notice those commentaries, the word biblical commentary on Isaiah is 1 to 34, and then volume 2 is 34 to 66. And they've done the
39,
same.
right?
Sorry. That's Isaiah.
39.
Isaiah. Yes, Isaiah. Yeah. Yeah, Isaiah's, no, it's not. Isaiah's 1 to 33, 34. But yes, that's the deal, because what the traditional critics would say is 1 to 39 is first Isaiah, 40 and following is second Isaiah. But uh, again, that's another lecture for another day. So
Yes,
I
okay.
think that you couldn't, when you see a Torah scroll and you see a young boy becoming going through his bar mitzvah, that he carries the whole Torah around, helped by his father and maybe his uncle, because the thing is so big. The Torah scroll is huge and heavy, so it's very cumbersome. So I think the 5 books are simply just to make the the books of Moses more accessible and easy to work with.
Yes, thank you. And what is your opinion? Why many Egyptologists don't believe in documentary hypothesis, but many biblical scholars believe? So we have a division. Why? Why is that so?
Well, I mean, let's face it, most Egyptologists don't care about the Bible. Okay. Earlier generation, if you go back the mid 1900s and earlier, Egyptologists were interested in the Bible because especially in the British universities, everybody studied Hebrew. I mean, like Kenneth Kitchen was studying Hebrew as a first-year student in Egyptology, and he didn't even know it was the Bible because he came from a secular home. And so he in his school, public school, they were told him Bible stories. And when he started reading the Hebrew, he says, "This sounds like the stories I heard when I was a child." So it was common for people in Near Eastern studies to study Egyptology. You also read Hebrew or Greek and Latin. So, but now there are really a small number of people who are Egyptologists who have know the Bible, know Hebrew, etc. So I would say that of that group, I would half would follow traditional criticism of the Old Testament. The other half would reject it.
All right, thank you. Let's talk about your teacher, Donald Redford. Yeah, he believes that the event of Pharaoh's birthday fits better with practices from the Saite period. He also points out that the certain birds, such as Harry, please help me about that.
Very
So
tep, yeah,
those, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Do such elements suggest that the story of Joseph has its origin in a later period than scholars like Kate Kitchen propose?
right. Well, this is the new direction this argument is going. So what Redford said back then is being followed by people like Bernd Schipper, German scholar who does Egyptology and Old Testament. Um, um, uh, yeah, so that is a more common view now. Um, because what happens is these scholars are saying, okay, the Egyptian stuff is undeniable. And we know it couldn't have come from Moses because he didn't exist and the Hebrews weren't there. So where did it come from? So they don't allow the possibility that these things could go back to the time of Moses. So they have to look for a period when Egypt and the Judeans were interacting. And what they propose is the Saite period. Now, I've just written about this in a couple of different places. And I said that's the most unlikely time for that to happen. Because what happens during this period? The Saite kings kill King Josiah. The Saite kings take Jehoahaz II off the throne, take him to Egypt where he dies. They put on the throne Eliakim, who comes Jehoiakim, and he is a puppet of the Saites. So are you saying at a time when the Saites have been hostile against you, we're going to say, oh, we want all these wonderful Egyptian things in our lives now? It doesn't make any sense. You would think they would hate the Egyptians at this time, and they don't have the cultural influence on them. So that does not make good sense to me. What Redford does, and I love the man, he died a year ago too. So all my teachers are disappearing now. But what he does is he'll find something that exists in the later periods, but then doesn't pay as much attention to it when it occurs in earlier periods. So I think it's because he had an agenda. He wanted things to move in a certain direction, probably just as much as I want to see them go in the other direction. But what at least I try to be honest in saying, look, okay, we have evidence for this from this period through this period. But let's look at the other things and which periods do they fall into, not just pick one or two, but looking at all the data in the story, what does it show us? So yes, obviously I disagree with my professor. We remain good friends, and I dedicated my book Akhenaten and the Origins of Monotheism to him. So we disagreed, but I respect him, and he was a brilliant man.
What he thought about your work and views about Exodus, Joseph.
I don't know what he said behind my back, but I don't think we. I was on a panel discussion with him once, and I was basically trying to uh, argue a philosophical point. And he started his presentation with, I don't know why conservatives get so angry and excited about these things and get all upset when you challenge them. And then later in the panel, I challenged him. And then he pounded the table and started arguing and yelling. And I said, okay, it works both ways, doesn't it? You get upset too. But it was humorous when he reacted the very way he was accusing conservatives of reacting to criticism. So yeah, I don't know what he thought of me. I mean, he was proud of me as a student because I had done some good things. That much I do know. But on because I do a lot of Egyptological stuff. My excavations and many of my publications are purely Egyptological. So yeah.
Great story. And what about that word, hairy tam? Is that
Yeah.
originate from first millennium BC?
Oh no. No. What happens is there's a shift in vocalization, and he's trying to say it fits better into this period. His argument was actually countered by I'm trying to remember, it was Joachim Quack, who was Egyptologist from Heidelberg, or I can't remember. It was a European Egyptologist who argued linguistically that the word hairy, Khartoumim, came into the Hebrew language at a very early date. And so he argued completely against Redford. And to my knowledge, this guy has no religious interest whatsoever. He's just a linguist.
Okay, but do we have examples of birthday for Pharaoh in the time
Birthday.
of New Kingdom? And yeah,
Yeah, well, yes. Well, what I've argued, and personally, I think he actually says that this birthday of the king stuff is Persian, not Saite. But in any event, what I have argued in my book, Israel in Egypt, which was published in 1997 from Oxford University Press. This book has now been expanded to be over 200,000 words, and a new edition is coming out with a different publisher early next year, and it's called Israel in and Out of Egypt. There's a very long chapter on the Joseph story in this book. But one of the things I argued is that in Egypt, what is celebrated is not the biological birth of the king, but what was celebrated is his birth as the incarnate son of Re. When the king is crowned, he becomes the living Horus, the son of the sun god, the son of the sun. And so that annual celebration, the celebration of the coronation, when the king became king and became the son of the sun god, that was celebrated every year. So what I'm arguing for is what is being celebrated is not his biological birth, but his birth as the king. And that was celebrated.
Amazing, thank you. Redford again argues that parallels between Neo-Assyrian and Joseph reward scene, there is many similarities. So does that show that this story is from later time, or?
Well, I don't think it. I don't think it does. Um, I showed you the evidence that we have that goes back as early as I think the earliest examples we have are 14th century in Egypt. There's been a whole book on this subject um, by I'm trying to remember her name. Uh, well, skip my name, but she's an Australian Egyptologist. She wrote her doctoral dissertation on looking at all the reward scenes from all periods. I can't remember, there's a couple hundred. So she's documented them all, and she has um, uh, anyway, I feel badly. I can't, her name doesn't pop into my head. Um, but she, yeah, she argues very favorably for the connection between this scene that we were looking at in the lecture moments ago and the Joseph story. So she is the latest word. I think her dissertation was maybe 10 years ago. Um, but yeah, she was at Macquarie University in Australia, Sydney. Um, her name was Susanna. Her husband's an Egyptologist, but they don't share the same name. Her husband is Boyo Alkenga, an Egyptologist. Susanna Fisher, maybe? Anyway, this is a problem with getting old.
Yeah, never mind about those names, but often scholars would point out that, okay, there are parallels in the 14, 15, and before centuries. There are few later, so we have to cover all those periods in older time and later. So, for example, we have Deuteronomy. We have parallels between Hittite, the treaty, but also with Neo-Assyrians. So we have both. So
Yeah,
Deuteronomy should be later, right? Right, something like that.
yeah, yeah. Well, again, if we go back to Kenneth Kitchen, his massive volume, I'll just step away here for a second. These 3 volumes. This one is uh,
Yep, that's huge.
1,100 pages, 1,100 pages. And he has every treaty, law code from the earliest Sumerian text all the way down to Hannibal and Roman treaty. And he looks form critically at them. And then uh, he lays them out by their categories and color codes them and says, okay, looking at these, where do these fit? And um, when we get to the first millennium, and if you just look at the colors, can you see that?
We can
Okay,
see
the
now.
focus. Okay, so this is what the Assyrian period color coded by the different parts of the treaty look like. And then if you go to the Hittite and the biblical, um, where are we? well, yeah. So the color changes. His point would be the color changes. Uh, Again, it's all about the different components, and he color codes the components because trees have different components. And when you lay it out like that, the biblical, like Exodus or Deuteronomy, fits very nicely into these uh, treaty patterns. And the Assyrian one is altogether different. So yeah, he's collected all the data, 3 volumes, and somebody writes a small little article with one little text from the Assyrian. Well, that's a joke. Kitchen's life was the commitment to getting all the data, putting it on the table. What does it tell us? Don't pick a little bit here. Don't pick a little bit there to fit your theory. Look at everything. And by golly, he did.
Unbelievable, yeah. That's why he is the biggest. Was Joseph really a vizier? Some scholars question this title and argue that a foreigner could not have held such a high position in Egypt. What is your response?
Well, I think my response is the gentleman whose tomb I showed you today, Upper L. Uh, and of course, we've only known about him since the late 1980s. So somebody who says something like that is outdated. They're no longer they're no longer up on the latest archaeology of Egypt. But clearly, you can't use that argument in the light of this discovery. And also, we know of a general, one of the top generals of Ramses II, uh, named Urkhia. Again, he has a Semitic name. His tomb has recently been excavated. It's at Saqqara, not too far from that of Opera. He was a general, top general, and has either a Semitic or a Mitannian Hurrian name. So yeah, so we know there are generals, we know there are viziers, we know there are royal messengers. So yeah, that's anybody who claims that now is ignorant.
Interesting. Thank you. We have a Dorothy Irwin and similar scholars that point to various parallels between the story of Joseph and Egyptian myths. Do such parallels automatically imply that the genre of this biblical story is the same and that all these events are actually mythological?
Yeah. Well, I think again, Kenneth Kitchen has done a devastating criticism of Dorothy Irwin. And the problem is that she was a literature person. She didn't know Hebrew. She didn't know the Old Testament. And she happened to be the short-lived wife of Thomas Thompson, if you know that name, from the Copenhagen School. But Thomas
Yes.
Thompson is really the one who started the recent, well, the 1970s decline of his book, The Historicity of the Patriarchal Narratives, 1974 or 5, is really where the last 50 years, the decline of the historicity of the Old Testament began with him, and then John Van Seters, who was another one of my professors, who is no longer with us. But yeah, so Dorothy Irwin was a literature person, and I think her views of the Old Testament was influenced by Thomas Thompson, her short-lived husband. I don't think they're married long, or but in any event, uh, yeah, I don't think anybody takes the work she did very seriously.
Amazing. Okay, last question. We have J.M.A. Jensen. He concluded that the narrative of Joseph sometimes contains an idealized portrayal of Egypt. Do we really have an idealized portrayal of Egypt and what that means, even? Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't have a problem with idealization. Um, uh, I mean, when you think of Egypt today, people think pyramids or mummies or whatever. Um, and so idealization is not necessarily wrong. It's not making stuff up that isn't true. It maybe is focusing on some area um, for propagandistic purposes or whatever it might be, but that doesn't make it wrong. So I guess that doesn't bother me so much. But I guess I would want to understand what he says a little more.
Okay, Professor Hoffmeier, do you have any conclusion and advice for students and many people that want to study this topic about Joseph and this section of the Genesis 37 to 50? And what is the current dominant view in academy about historicity of Joseph?
Yeah. Well, I would say the prevailing view has been for 20 or more years has been that Joseph is a novella. It's a novel, it's a short story. Now they're even calling it a diaspora novella about Jewish heroes who are living outside of Israel, and they would put the book of Esther in that category, and so on. So obviously, I've argued against that. In my new book, Israel in and out of Egypt, which should be out, as I said, early in 26. I've expanded my chapter on Joseph. It's now the longest chapter in the book. So anyway, I would recommend anybody to read that. Kenneth Kitchen had hoped to write a book on Joseph, but then he let these big projects like the Treaty Law and Covenant book and some of his other huge projects. He never got to finish the book on Joseph that he wanted to do. So what I've written in this new chapter in my new book would probably be the longest sustained discussion of historicity, Egyptian backgrounds that you're going to find in the literature.
Incredible. I can't wait your books. So too bad that Kitchen didn't make it to write that also, but yeah,
Yes.
okay. All right. So, dear audience, thanks for watching. A huge thank to our Professor Hoffmeier for sharing his time, insights, and expertise with us. So, if you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, keep thinking deeply, asking hard questions, and exploring the stories that shaped our civilization. See you in the next episode, and greetings from Serbia.